In this next section, we're going to take what we did in our shading tutorials and move it into the camera. So what I want to do is just show you how to set up a basic camera. Now we've positioned it, and this is actually what renders, and it looks fine. There's nothing wrong with it. We've got our ground there with displacement and bump maps. We've got our lighting. We've got textures and materials on the car. That's all great. But the camera could be better. And I'm coming from a photographer, a videographer standpoint for so many years that, well, this default camera is fine, but a lot of people don't often change it. So what I want to do is take this camera and move it back. Okay, because if we were doing a real photo shoot, we wouldn't really be kind of standing here that close. We'd be back here and getting some depth and changing that perspective. So having said that, what I want to do is select the camera in the item list, and let's go ahead and take a look at the properties over here. We've got our typical position, rotation, scale, which you really don't scale the camera, but you can reset these values once you position them. We've got our target distance about 8 meters, and our grid right now is 1 meter, so about 8 meters away from our target. I showed you how sync to view worked a little bit earlier, so let's close that up. Now our default camera is a projection type set to perspective. You can change this to an orthogonal view, which gives you this really forced perspective look, which is great for CAD and engineering and architecture, and that's kind of the look you'd want sometimes where you really want those nice forced diagonal lines. Good for infographics as well if you're making them in 3D. Cylindrical, if you want just a kind of a y-axis cylindrical view, you can see each side of the car right here. But at the same time, you can do a spherical. And this is great if you're doing stuff with an Oculus Rift, or you're doing some kind of VR, or even just want to make your own probe images, your own HDR images right out of Moto. Okay, but for now, and for most things, we're going to use a perspective camera. So our default here right now that we've been working with is perspective, 30 millimeters. What I want to do is just move this camera back. So I'll press W on the on the keyboard screen. And the problem is, well, my axis now is aligning to the work plane, which is basically Y up, X left and right, and Z forward and back, or Z, depending on which part of the world you come from. I want to move this thing directly back, and certainly I can move it a little this way and a little this way, or I can grab this handle here, which negates the Y entirely and just allows me to move it. And that's really probably the quickest way I would do it. But I do want to show you how you can actually use some of the tools to make things move. So just come up over here to Action Center, change that to local, and now when I press W, those handles orientate themselves to the camera's position. And that's really one of my favorite things, is to go back and forth from local to world like that. So now I'm going to pull that all the way back, nice and direct, pull it down a little bit, press E for rotate, and we're going to rotate it up a bit. And maybe I'll move it up just a little bit more, just like that. Spacebar turns it off, Command S to save. Well, that's all great, that's good, but the camera's kind of far away now. Well, think of this, what we did is we walked with the camera, right? We just literally had it on our shoulder and we walked away with it. This focal length over here in the top right, this is our zoom. This is the zoom button on the camera. And we're going to click and drag on those arrows to zoom the camera in. Like that. And then I'll press E, grab the red just to rotate a little bit and make sure we don't get too far up so we don't go to the end of the ground. And so now what we've done, spacebar to turn that off, is we've changed our perspective and we've given it a little bit more realistic look. It doesn't seem like much, but it's those subtle differences in lighting and shadows and shading and your camera angles that are going to help your images have that much more realism. And it showed you how you can control the camera too. The other advantage of being far back like this is we can create some depth of field, which will help this background fall off. So to do that, we're just going to select the camera in the item list, go to Camera Effects, go to this tab right here on the right, and at the very top is depth of field. Turn that on. Okay, doesn't look like much happens, but I can see it starting to go right here. The default settings right here, F4, the iris blades, the iris rotation, that's all great. But sometimes you might need to adjust that. In this case, we're looking pretty good. I can actually see the back of the car blurring a little bit. And I'm starting to see the fronts a little bit here. Well, why is that? Well, we have to initially tell the computer where that focal length is. And really the best way to do that is just autofocus. Okay, so what did I do there? Well, let me undo real quick. And if I press Y on my keyboard, I get this wonderful tool that is our scale, our rotation, and our move all together. And in addition to that, there's this little doohickey right here. And I can click and drag that. But what I really need to do is just click autofocus. And it looks at the nearest polygon and it attaches to it and off it goes. So now I've set a focal distance of 14 meters versus the standard, or not standard, but that 8 that was there before. So now the computer knows, okay, this is where I want to focus. And then when I get outside of that, I'm going to start falling off and having a little more out of focus, a little more depth of field. And the advantage of that is that this background will blur and it will just give us a little bit more realism. To show you this, I'm going to bring this f-stop down to 1. Okay. Now, the best lens I had, which was a $2,000 lens, had a 1.2 aperture. And it was very, very hard to use, but excellent when it was working because the depth of field was so shallow, you really had to nail that focus. Okay. In the computer, it's a little bit different sometimes, depending on all the other parameters in terms of how far the camera is and the size of the object and all those things. So try not to, if you know f-stops, try not to equate them with the real world. Even though lower is going to give you more depth of field, higher is going to keep things more in focus outside of this focal distance. But for the most part, you have to adjust this until it's the look that you want. And I can see the edge right here now. See that? It's getting a little bit softer. We're in focus here, and it's starting to fall off like that. And you can even see right there, it's already blurring. And you know what? Let's just leave it at that and see how it goes. Now, this blurring also becomes, it's like an iris, like a lens. So you can change the iris rotation, you can change some of the edge weighting for how that blur happens, and you can change the amount of blades. And that's going to just create a cleaner depth of field. All right, so I'm going to save this scene, and I'm going to render out a frame. So we'll hit render. I'll pause this, and we'll come back when this is finished. Okay, so here's a render of the car. And it's looking a little funny, isn't it? Well, it's got some too much light under there. What's going on? Well, don't forget, we had a pretty hot environment on the left side. It's also a very good lesson to show you that you can never trust anything until the final render. Because our render window in Moto actually looked pretty good. But the final, which is really what our output will be, doesn't look quite right. Well, there's a simple reason for that. Our angle's good, our camera's good, even our lighting is good. What's happening, though, is on the ground, because we're messing with that so much, we need to change our Fresnel effect. Okay, so let's take a look at that. So for the ground material right here, we have a 100% Fresnel effect. Okay, which means this glancing angle, it's actually getting very bright. Again, think about laying down, sitting in front of an ocean or in front of a lake with the light. It's going to be very reflective. So as it renders, all of that brightness is hitting that ground. So I'm literally just going to turn off the Fresnel effect on the ground. And let's not also forget that we never did anything with this desert ground. So what I want to do is turn that on. I've shown you different ways to blend it, but what we're going to do now is actually just lay that desert ground right on top of our displacement map, everything else, and completely change the look of the scene. So we no longer have a very bright, shiny ground. We still have our kind of desert cracked look. We've got this nice mixed texture on top, and we've got a bump map as well. The one thing I would do, however, is with this cellular, I'm going to right-click on it. I'm going to create an instance, and I'm going to right-click on this and take the basic channel to the diffuse amount. Not the diffuse color, but the diffuse amount. And watch what happens. And we're doing more and more to this scene, so this render takes a little bit longer to calculate. Aha. So remember we had the bright areas were the cracks and the dark areas were essentially the tiles, but then we inverted that so that those cracks went down. Well, by setting that instance, which is essentially a copy of the first one, to diffuse amount, we now are saying to those little cracks, don't take any light from the scene. Those bright values in there are pulling away light, and we get that nice kind of crack look we're after. All right, so I'm saving this scene. All right, so here we go with a final render. Let this one process right in the window now that everything looks good. And you can see we've got some really great looking depth of field that falls off really well back there. We probably have too much on and it kind of makes this thing look a little bit miniature, but that's also a good thing too. If you are trying to make a miniature looking scene, you can do it this way as well. And just really increase that depth of field by bringing that f-stop value down. You can even see right here in the front, this is out of focus. So there's some more tweaks I would make just to, change a few things, maybe some of the rivets back here, maybe darken some of these metal brackets on the hood, things like that. But overall, with this camera setting, it can work really well for many things, especially when you're trying to create a little bit more realism by adding depth of field. All right, so let's go on to our next camera tutorial and talk about a few more things that are very important.